Hello, hello, hello. Um, about 6 months ago, I posted on my Instagram, and what I asked about was the idea of loneliness. And I asked, I was genuinely curious because I was wondering about people's experience with loneliness and how and what they'd learned from it, and whether they thought it was a good thing or a bad thing. And I asked it at a time when I just moved out here, and I was surrounded by my friends. I was surrounded by people who I'd been coming up with in the past 3 years, and so I wasn't alone. And yet I felt kind of lonely, despite the fact that I wasn't alone by myself. And it got me really thinking about people's experience with it and what loneliness means to me, and why sometimes loneliness can feel like such a powerful, really relevant tool, but at other times it's the worst feeling ever, right? So here's what I've learned. I think a lot of people, a lot of very wise people, have said a lot of very wise things about loneliness. And so I don't want to really add to that noise unless I could say something of value. And the only things I can share are my own experiences. And I think that there's a distinction to be made that's really important. Because every time I would read one of those replies that was in the positive, that was for loneliness, I felt like I wasn't really reading someone's thoughts about loneliness. And so I started really thinking about what is this? People seem to love loneliness, but it's killing me. And what I found was I think there's a distinction between solitude and loneliness. And it's a very important distinction because solitude is like a self inflicted loneliness. We choose to put ourselves in a state of solitude so that we can be with ourselves and ask ourselves questions and learn from ourselves. And the reason solitude isn't as scary is exactly because of that element of choice. I've chosen that I'm not going to go to that party today. I've chosen that I don't want to be with people today. I just want to be in my room. I just want to be alone. But loneliness isn't self inflicted, right? Loneliness, in the definition that I'm talking about, comes about when you don't want to be just with your thoughts. You don't want to be alone, but you don't really have an option. And then it's a question of, how can you be lonely when you're surrounded by a crowd of people? And that's something I've been struggling with figuring out for a while, but I think it's because you can be around a bunch of people and still feel lonely if in that group you don't feel like you belong, like you're not contributing. I mean, that's a self-evident claim, of course. But that distinction to me is really important because I've had experiences when I've been far from home, and I've been far from home, and I've been far from my friends and my family and everyone who's important to me, and it's been some of the greatest time of my life. But I've also had the experience where I just saw my family and then I left, and all of a sudden I'm in China alone and I'm like on the verge of tears every night because I just want to go home. And the thing about it is that I think loneliness reminds us of this, I think, genetically hard coded fear that we are ultimately completely alone in the world, right? We came in alone, we're going to go alone. And I read this fascinating thing. There's this really cool YouTube channel called Kurzgesagt. I think I said that right. And they did the thing about loneliness, and they talked about how it might be hardwired into our evolutionary DNA, because back when we were very tribal, if the group excluded you and you became lonely, right, you were likely going to die. And so this idea that there's a fear of loneliness in all of us, I do believe it to be true. And I think a lot of times when we talk about, I'm not scared to be alone, I love being alone, we're not talking about loneliness, we're talking about solitude. We're talking about that willingness, that desire. But what if you want to be around people and all of a sudden you can't? Or what if you want to be around people that make you feel like you're part of that tribal group, right? Whatever that is, friends, family, a sports team, doesn't matter. But you can't be around them for whatever reason. Maybe there's an internal block, maybe there's something going on with your mental health, maybe whatever. right? There's a lot of good reasons that can happen, very valid reasons. But while silence and loneliness, while loneliness reminds us that we're ultimately alone, I think solitude reminds us of our strength in the face of that, right? Solitude reminds us that yes, I am alone, but I am enough. I am strong, right? And that's a really cool distinction to me because I've been thinking a lot about this in the past 6 months as I've experienced both sides of it, and I feel like that distinction can be very valuable because for me, in my experience, what I've found is that if I'm lonely and I'm really starting to struggle and suffer because of it, I can flip the script really quick by kind of, Bruce Lee had this great quote that I live by a lot. He said, and I'm probably paraphrasing and messing it up, but it was something like, if you're in a room with 10 men and they lock the door, remember that you're not stuck in the room with them, they're stuck in the room with you. And it's kind of that mentality of switching the same scenario that I think is very valuable when dealing with feeling alone, feeling distant from things that are meaningful to you. So you can go from being like, oh, I miss everyone, I don't want to do this, I want to go home, I want to be around people who I want to be with, to switch it to say, this is an opportunity for me to talk to myself, for me to figure out me and just enjoy that moment where I'm not obliged to be around anyone. I'm not obliged to socialize. And I think people live on the spectrum where some people more naturally fall on one end to the other, right? That's that whole conversation about introverts and extroverts and stuff. But loneliness reminds us of our fear, really, of kind of this reality that we don't really like to acknowledge a lot, that we came in alone and we'll leave alone, and everything in the middle is just brownie points. But solitude reminds us that that's enough, that it's enough that we're doing it alone. Done.